Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is at Close Talking. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn, and Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. On Instagram, the show is at Close Talking Poetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/closetalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show. Hello and welcome to an all-new episode of Close Talking. I am your co-host, Jack Rossiter Munley.
And I am your other co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
Oh, we are two dudes with six names between us and one combined, overarching, all-consuming love of poetry. And today we have gathered to talk about a poem that I picked because I came across it somewhere that maybe y'all did too. It's called "'Tis a Fearful Thing" by Yehuda Halevi, and it was featured in the final episode, minor poetic spoilers, I guess, for Godless, but it was in the final episode of the recent beautiful Netflix series, Western Godless. And we'll talk a little bit about, I think, the way that it shows up in that series with no plot spoilers at all, just the fact that it's in it.
I haven't even seen it, so I can't spoil anything. But
that's fantastic.
I'll provide some hot takes.
Yeah, hot take from me. You should definitely watch it because it's stupendous. But yeah, I first came across this poem there, and so I really wanted to talk about it because I think it's pretty great. Quickly before reading it, a little bit about Yehuda Halevi and the attribution of this poem. So most of the places that I've seen this poem reproduced, it is attributed to Yehuda Halevi. The series creator of Godless says that's who he got it from and where he first came across it, which is by no means like gospel truth, but it's sort of the best that we can surmise because he really was ancient. He was born in like 1075 to 1086 type range and died in 1141. So, you know, about 1,000 years ago, he was doing his thing. There are some people online who have attributed it to Chaim Stern, who's a translator born in 1930. It's possible, I guess, that he wrote this, but it seems most likely that the translation that we are using and that is most commonly reproduced in like the contemporary world is his translation of it. Again, we don't know that for sure, and it's possible that he wrote it, but that's the best guess based on all the information at our disposal. This is a great time to mention that if you happen to have definitive information, or if you want to look into it and let us know so that we don't say wrong stuff and bad things, you can let us know. Probably by email is the best, closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com. But Yehuda Halevi himself, his childhood was sort of during the First Crusade, which took place in the late 10s. It was like 1095 to 1099, I think. And he was a Jewish poet who was born in Spain and then traveled around and actually died shortly after he first took a trip to the Holy Land, right after he landed. It's believed in Palestine in 1141 is when he died. But he was known for being a poet. He was also a physician, and he was just generally a very prolific writer and thinker.
Yeah, he was also a philosopher, kind of theologian, which at that era sort of seemed like similar. But his most famous work is the Kuzari, I believe, the Book of Refutation and Proof in Support of the Abased Religion. And that apparently is one of the most important apologetic works of Jewish philosophy.
But without further ado, here is the poem. "'Tis a Fearful Thing" by Yehuda Halevi. 'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch, a fearful thing to love, to hope, to dream, to be, and oh, to lose. A thing for fools, this, and a holy thing to love. For your life has lived in me, your laugh once lifted me, your word was gift to me. To remember this brings painful joy. 'Tis a human thing, love, a holy thing to love what death has touched.
Excellent.
As you might surmise, the place this shows up in the show is at a funeral.
I might have guessed that. Yeah, so that's where you first encountered it. So what was the kind of, or context, or at least context of your thoughts about it when you encountered it, without spoiling anything about the show that I am probably going to see right after we record? Well, I don't know, but I'll pretend. I mean, I'll say that for the show.
Connor, who as soon as we are off the air is going to rush directly to his computer, fire up Netflix, and watch Godless. My first thoughts were like, wow, that's a really great poem about loss and what it's like to remember someone who you loved and lost. And the person whose funeral it is someone who has both personal connections and like community involvement, because it's about sort of a small town. And so I was also thinking about like how someone's place in the community works, and that feeling of loss for a group of people. But the way that this poem is treated is sort of as summing up a lot of what's been going on in the show, and particularly in a show titled Godless. And this priest character reads it. So it's some kind of Christian or Catholic priest who's now finally traveled to the town reading a Jewish poem that does not, in fact, in the text specifically mention God. And that was, by all accounts, on the part of the series creator, all of that was pretty intentional in terms of what does God look like in this land of the West that he's created. But just that mixture of different religious traditions and the lack of any explicit mention of God, particularly coming from someone who's wearing a priest's collar, I found really fascinating and is part of what I just really responded to in the poem as sort of drawing human connections and saying that it's a holy thing to love your fellow man, to love what death can touch at the beginning, and then what death has touched at the end. So at the beginning, it's saying it's a fearful thing to love what death can touch. So you're taking a big risk in loving other people whose lives are impermanent, who will at some point no longer be with you. Either you will leave them or they will leave you. That human bond is a risk, and is a holy and exciting risk. And then at the end to say that, that risk was worth it. It's a holy thing to love what death has touched. Even that loss, the pain of the loss, does not outweigh the importance of the relationships that you form with people when they are around. And so this almost humanist message in the poem was something that I really responded to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I like thinking that's interesting, the context of the show. And I sort of out of context, I hadn't quite noticed the lack of the mention of God, but certainly in that specific, like, fictional TV plot context, that would be sort of drawn out very tellingly. But it is interesting, as you mentioned, that the word holy features prominently, which I think is, I wonder how sort of maybe radical that message would have been at the time, in, whatever, the 1,000 years ago, or even up till fairly recently. I mean, now there's a more accepted sense of secular humanism or transcendence, or spiritual life that's somehow divorced from a religious tradition. But this sort of suggesting that this act of loving something that can die can and is holy in itself is, a very interesting aspect of the poem. I like that.
I like that you mention how radical was it at the time of writing, because I was thinking about that as well, particularly because no matter what, this is a translation, because the original work was either it's a more contemporary poem or the original work was not in English. I think it's almost certain that this is a very old poem, originally not in English.
And probably in Hebrew, right?
Probably in Hebrew. Yeah. But I was thinking also about pretty much one of the biggest names in poetry is going to be Rumi, and he's huge. And he's also from quite a while ago. Yehuda Halevi in his schooling would have learned all about Arabic poetry and its various styles, and he in fact wrote a lot of his verses in those styles. I don't know specifically if this poem conforms to any of those or if this translation seeks to replicate some of those. But what's interesting about Rumi is that in his more contemporary and the super popular translations that are often proliferated, they rework many of those styles, and they also remove many of his explicit engagements with Islam, because Rumi had his own like spiritual journey from entering into sort of what we now know as like more mystical Islam in his later life. I was thinking about how the Rumi that we know and share in these like aphoristic little bits of almost, I don't want to say self-help because that seems derogatory, but like these quick one-liners about love and humanism and finding yourself and whatever are pretty far removed from the actual writer, who was really deeply engaged with spiritual questions, particularly through his lens of being an Islamic writer. I'm curious if this is a poem where also that element used to be there, and this used to be a more God-centered, and particularly, I am not by any means an expert in the Jewish tradition, but taking a Jewish perspective on like engagement and faith that has somehow been removed over time. And I don't know if it has or not, but I was curious about that.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. And now that I think about it, and the Khazari was written in Arabic, so this poem could have been also translated originally from the Arabic rather than Hebrew. But yeah, that's a good question, that we the radicalness could be from just the contemporary translation, and so in fact it's not radical per se, even though powerful in its own right. And that makes me think about, because translation is such an interesting sort of field generally, and also in poetry. And the one annoying thing personally is that I love like reading things so intensely closely, and like down to the line break and the commas and the punctuation and the syllables and the sounds, which you really can't do that in the same way with a translation, because you're more going to be reading what the translator's choice was, which is interesting in its own right, but you can't quite, sort of like if something's rhyming, or they pick this word next to that word or whatever, that that tells you about the translator, but it doesn't necessarily tell you about the original poet or the original text. And that there's a really interesting. I took a translation class in college, and the big sort of contention in translation theory can be boiled down to sort of two concerns. One is fidelity, and the other is sort of like the effect or the feeling. So when you're translating, you can, if you're a sort of fidelity extremist, you basically, you just get the literal words as close as possible, tethered. You probably like annotate it with footnotes that sort of contextualize everything. But often the poem is going to suck as a poem because it's going to be like clunky and awkward, and then you're going to have like little numbers on top and then like long academic prose on the bottom. And on the other hand, you have sort of the feeling or the effect where you just want to transmit the sort of, the sensation that one would get if they're reading the original poem. And that can be instinctually more appealing, but it also has its own dangers. One famous example is Ezra Pound translated a bunch of Chinese poetry and basically didn't know a lick of Chinese and just like wanted to make it snazzy in English. And his translations are very fascinating, but it was one of the first times that I think Chinese poetry had been translated in America, and certainly one of the most like famous. And so it sort of was an important moment in terms of like exposure of Chinese literature to America. And Pound was just like making shit up about like what he thought about these poems. And so did sort of like a cultural disservice in that regard, potentially. And so people try to find, a balance. But this also makes me think, because you were talking about Godless, which is this Western show, because one of the clips that we watched in this translation class was from Deadwood, which is that HBO Western show. And we basically just watched like this 2 minutes where they just said like every profanity you could think of. But the professor's point was, they didn't say, because it was taking place in, I don't know, the 1800s or 1700s, maybe the
1800s,
probably 1800s. They would have said like the Lord's name in vain, or like, but they wouldn't have said fuck. But if you were watching like the show and you just heard them saying like Jesus Christ or like something like that, that wouldn't be that shocking to you, even if it would have been like true to the time. And so the creators of the show made a choice to go for the effect, so that the show shocks you in the way that the town and its lawlessness would have shocked that society in that time, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of value to, responsibly, you don't want to just completely make things up as you're describing, but I think there's a lot of value in making the emotional resonance ring true. With this poem, one of the things that struck me, and I'm curious to know how much of it is in the translation, but the repetition of various terms is sort of striking throughout, and they recur in almost every time. It's almost the same, but just a little different each time. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on that and how repetition is used and how those slight tweaks work.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It's interesting thinking about the secular nature of the translation, whether they made a choice for effect or sensation given a more like secular audience, and therefore sort of removed the more religious connotations, because that would be a choice for like effect in a contemporary audience rather than fidelity. But yeah, getting to the repetition. Yeah, it's a very interesting. It's almost like this little like unfolding like bit by bit. Or like the movie Memento, the movie unfolds like it starts again and again and again and gradually gets longer or something like that. And so this sort of has a sort of like it steps out and then it steps out again and then steps a little further. So, you know, 'tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch. And then so we have that kind of statement, and then we're thinking about a fearful thing, to love, to hope, to dream, to be. But then we remove death in that little stanza. But then it kind of comes back again, to be and to lose. But it's sort of a different fashion. To me, it feels like there's a few ways that I think about it. One is that I noticed, one of the first things that I noticed was the change from can to has, where the first stanza is to love what death can touch, and the end is to love what death has touched. So in this sense, there's a passage of time that happens in the poem potentially, or either in the head or maybe in some kind of implied narrative sense, and where we're sort of either we're thinking about it in the abstract or we haven't yet lost someone or something, and then by the end of the poem we have. And so in that sense, I feel like the plotting of thoughts and of words is a way of slowing down the poem, but that also makes the movements of the poem more pronounced, so that we can sort of feel the movement itself, and so that can sort of simulate the passage of time. It sort of reminds me of To Make a Prairie.
I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah. Because how does that one go?
To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee, one clover and a bee and reverie. The reverie alone will do when bees are few, or if bees are few.
Yeah, if bees are few. Yeah, that's so good. And so, yeah, and that sort of is restating the claim. And because I feel like, you know, it's interesting, you know, that like Halevi was both a poet and this sort of philosopher. And this is kind of like a philosophical poem. And the question is like, why is it a poem and not sort of a philosophical text? And I feel like you've pointed out sort of the thing that makes it a poem is this kind of repetition, because it makes it not just a statement about what it is to love and, you know, what it is to lose, where if it was, it would sort of happen in a one continuous sort of sentence that sort of maybe makes all of the same points. But when you get the effect of reading it where if it was just like that, it's like this is just a very composed thought that happened like in an instant, basically, but it's just articulate. Whereas here, there's the unfolding of the thoughts itself, which sort of happens in the Dickinson poem. And that unfolding process, I think, is the essential poetic feature.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And that unfolding does make it feel like it takes longer than it does, because something that we talked about with To Make a Prairie is it's this super short poem, but it feels like there's so much more happening than the whatever 35 or so words would indicate. And this itself is through line breaks. It takes up most of a page, but it's very few words. It's an incredibly short poem, and especially with the repetition, it's even fewer. That's such a great point. And it takes about half the poem for the tenses to actually switch, because they don't switch until the block there is "for your life has lived in me." That's where the first has comes in. And that's where it switches to being past tense, and it talks about remembering and then repeats the end and the beginning and the end. And you're right, that really lends itself to this complete like unfurling of thought, because at first you're thinking about maybe the connection to the person, and then it switches to thinking about the fact that there is now loss mixed in with that.
Yeah, and it also, that's the first time that the second person is in there, which was another feature that I thought was very striking, and I think actually has a sort of a place in, like, that there's a sort of a poetic move that this is partaking in, or maybe even inaugurating or something, because it's so ancient. But where the beginning of the poem, while it is unfurling a thought slowly in the way that a poem might, there's sort of no sense of stakes for a long time. It's just sort of like thinking about the thought. And then as soon as it goes into the past tense, there's also this second person. For your life has lived in me, your laugh once lifted me, your word was gift to me. Which, as a side note, pretty nice translator move, because there's like these nice little lived in, lifted, gift in, kind of like internal rhyme going in there, which I like. And that sort of delayed introduction of the second person. Another prominent example of that is in Dylan Thomas's Villanelle, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." But yeah, but in that poem, each stanza is sort of talking about different kind of men or people who are getting to the end of their life, but it's mostly in the abstract, or theoretical, until the very last stanza, when the speaker sort of reveals that he's addressing his father who's dying, and so that sort of delays the stakes of the poem, which I think is an interesting effect, where you're able to sort of take the ideas in some ways on their own terms first, and then you kind of get this revelation that, like, oh, this is like what they've been thinking about this whole time. Which actually, now that I think about it, is also similar to this other famous, probably the only two famous villanelles, One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, which is that whole, like, the art of losing isn't hard to master. And the whole poem is about, I've lost, countries and a bank and cities. And it's sort of like, feels almost light until the very last stanza, when it goes, "And even losing you." And then you sort of get why the whole poem's reason for existence is, like, dealing with this immense loss in some fashion has sort of prompted the speaker to sort of like really think about what it means to lose and what it means to love.
Definitely. That's such a good point. I was also thinking of, in the way that this works, it reminded me a little bit of a twist on how What the Living Do works, where everything sort of condenses to one point in that poem. Whereas here, you start with the ideas, it condenses down to this section that's about, not just does it introduce you, but it's specifically about you and me. So it suddenly has become very personal. But then from that inflection point, it goes back out into the ideas, which have been reframed by that inflection point, which I really, really liked.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and I think that would be an interesting, and maybe it's been written about, but I would love to read something that sort of tracks how the abstract and the kind of concrete, like, are negotiated in poems. Because if I had to do a hot take, like, I do feel like now we're in a contemporary moment where the abstract only has a place after the personal or the stakes or the concrete has been, like, realized, and only then do you have an authority to sort of make a claim that big. And I also think that, it's an interesting, like, this poem has so much going on, and it helps knowing that it's, A, translation, and B, and very ancient. But if I had never seen it before, and like a student brought this in for me, like, I would rip it apart probably, because I'd be like, there's no concrete detail, because that's like the one thing that I preach about, which I think reflects sort of a change in poems generally, where like they used to have a much more didactic, but in a wise way, sort of aphoristic role, or, you know, this is where you get your wisdom, to a kind of vessel for personal expression or something. And so if in the contemporary context, this was produced, not that it, I mean, and that would be my, when I say rip it apart, it's like sort of my surface judgment, because I'm sort of like in the weeds with contemporary poetry, and it doesn't work as much as a vessel for personal expression. Its personal stakes serve the larger philosophical argument, I think.
I think that's a great point, because I'm trying to think of another poem that we've looked at that has been this detached from anything concrete. And I don't think we've done one, because even To Make a Prairie is about a physical existing idea of like the prairie is a real thing that you can picture right away. This is about like death, which has a physicality to it, but nowhere near the same as a prairie or a clover and a bee. Like, this is a very philosophically based, idea heavy poem. It gives it a broad applicability the way that a lot of aphoristic poetry gets to have, and so it can be a poem from almost 1,000 years ago that can be put into a show set in the 1880s that can speak to me as a viewer in 2017. Admittedly, the show about the 1880s is meant to speak to me as a 2017 viewer, but the fact that this poem's presence in it doesn't feel like, where'd this poem come from? The way that another one that specifically references, I don't know, like tractors or something, or a red wheelbarrow, might be like, where's this coming from? You know, have wheelbarrows really been invented yet? I don't know. It's the 1880s. It's possible, but I've never seen one, and maybe they weren't called that then. You know, like the lack of specificity does give it a different kind of bent. And I think your point is well taken, that you almost never run into poems, especially now, but even kind of in general, that are this far removed. Because even fanciful poems or more experimental poems usually have a grounding in some kind of specific imagery. Maybe it's wacky, wild imagery, but it's usually, you know, The Wasteland is like still grounded in a lot of specific,
for
wild
sure
stuff. You know, like even poems that go way out there are not necessarily these completely philosophical, I don't even know what the word I'm looking for is, like just a philosophical rumination on a big subject like love and death.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And actually the red wheelbarrow serves as a good like marker of how things have changed, because that begins with the stanza, so much depends upon, and then it moves into the red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater, blah blah blah. But like the fact that Williams feels like the most he can get away with in terms of like an abstract philosophical argument is to say so much depends upon. It's like, so much of what? Like, you can't even, it's just like something abstract is important that's related to this image that's very specific or something. And I think that does sort of show the increasing dominance of sort of concrete imagery, which has sort of always been important. But then, I mean, in that specific modernist context, it's had its most extreme sort of presence in the short-lived but influential Imagist movement, which Williams sort of was playing around with for a while. But then at the same time, one thing that is, I think, it's this poem's strength is it's one kind of like big, almost concrete image, which is the use of the word touch in relation to death. So what death can touch, what death has touched. which I think is, I mean, for me, I think it's striking because death is such an extreme and devastating and but also like large concept, but it's extremity, you know, is it's infinite, and touch is, you know, almost the opposite in terms of extremity, where you can, it's just the initial point of contact between two things. You know, it's not what death has, you know, wrangled and dragged down into the pissy abyss kind of thing. It's just like what death has touched merely. And I think that sort of gentle connotation paired alongside death has a physicality to it that I think does a lot of work for the poem.
Definitely, because it's so tactile, and it's also not vicious. It's actually not fearful. I'm not afraid of a touch. It's almost gentle and familiar. It's the same kind of touch that you would expect this person who's writing has had with the person they've lost and is writing about. It's the kind of interaction you'd expect them to have as people who were very close. Like it's just an intimate gesture.
Like the Grim Reaper is only the Grim Reaper in part because of the scythe. Like kind of there's the menacing black garb or whatever, but the scythe is sort of the instrument of death, which if it was just, you know, a light hand, that would be a very different sort of connotation. So I do think that, yeah, that's all I got.
No, that's a great point. And there is a bit of an implied imagery in the personification of death and in the touching, because it conjures, it doesn't explicitly state, but it does conjure an image of a physical entity of death and something for it to touch. In this case, you get the picture during the poem that is probably like a deceased friend or loved one of the author. So while there isn't explicit imagery, I do think that right at the beginning, it gives you the closest thing it can to physical images that it's going to.
Yeah, no, I agree.
At least in the show Godless, it also sort of speaks to how God operates in the world of the show, which is that it really is the creator has talked about like this truly is a place where there is no official God necessarily present, but in his creation, the presence of God is in the communities that people would create for each other and the care that they would show for each other in the face of like a harsh landscape and the many challenges of quote unquote frontier life. So I think that's kind of a neat way to show it with this poem. Apparently he didn't tell any of the actors that this was going to get read, and they all just like completely lost it when they heard it the first time.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the other thing that I like too, as we talk about this unfolding process, is I like that the word, because of the repetition of words, you sort of like, I sort of read it like I just like there's terms. It's like a term poem where there's like fearful, death, love, lose, holy, you know, those are all like important blocks in the text in a way that other poems they might not be. But so that makes me think a lot when the word human comes in at the end in the last stanza. 'Tis a human thing, love, a holy thing to love, what death has touched. And there I get this sense that I like that the word human has also been delayed, because then it makes me think that the poem is sort of, as it's also grieving the loss of this person, it's also building a sort of like case for the features of what it is to be human, which is to say that it is to love, to lose, also to fear, also to be a fool, and also to be holy. And kind of the nice thing about, at least the way that reads to me, is there's, you sort of, the poem makes the case without it directly, explicitly making the case, and so it's just a case that you have to connect yourself without knowing it. And so even if you're a person who thinks being human involves fear, but it's not holy, or you can be foolish, but that's not, the best humans are purely rational beings, or blah, blah, blah. Each moment in the poem, but leading up to that is like a small thing that you can get on board with, basically. And then the sort of implied connection as a human thing at the end sort of tricks you into sort of connecting all of those things, which I think is very sort of effective.
That's a great point. Especially, I love that you bring out the fact that so much is implied in the poem. Just it kind of forces you to write yourself into it. It makes you such an active reader of the poem that you're almost putting your own experiences in the place of this non-specific language, which is so cool.
Yeah, that's a great point, because so that sort of reminds me, I was listening to this podcast called Literary Friction, and they were talking about novellas, and they were interviewing this writer from Wales, Conan Jones, who has written a bunch of short novels. But one that they were talking about was called The Cove, which is basically just this guy, I haven't read it, but who's on the lake, and then he gets struck by lightning, and it's kind of this, saga. But he was talking about how to make the sea, even though it was sort of based on his specific sea off of Wales, like a universal sea. And he was talking about how people would come up to him or write to him and say, I just loved how vivid, your descriptions of the sea were, and I just felt like I was there. And he was like, well, but look back at the language. Basically all I say is there's a scraggle of rocks and a wave here or there, or and really it's just he made it so it's just the bare bones enough that you find yourself doing all the work to make it your own sea. And if you can succeed in making the reader do that work, then it's going to be so much more vivid than if it's super detailed, because the reader's creating it, and it's going to be their own sea that they know intimately well. So I think you're right that this poem is sort of operating in that same way.
That's such a cool illustration of the point too, that you can just say oh yeah, gleaming blue water and a scraggle of rocks, and it was oh shit, he must live in my town.
Yeah,
that's so cool.
I know.
It fits this poem so exactly, because I could see all different circumstances of loss, because this could be any kind of very meaningful loss in your life. It doesn't tell you it's a family member or a romantic partner or a pet, or and it's like a personal loss of some sort. So I doubt it would be oh no, I've lost my country, I guess, but maybe it could be. I don't know. It's a great point.
Yeah, maybe countries can laugh. I don't know. Not many are laughing these days, let me tell you.
That's so true. There is an international happiness index, so
there you go.
There's a whole realm of happiness studies. How cool is that?
That is kind of cool. Yeah, I like
that. Do you have anything else?
Well, the only thing is that the flip side of the bare bones relying on the reader is, if it doesn't work, then it doesn't do anything. It's just a pile of language that you read it, and then you're like, well, guess I'll go have my biscuits. And so there is a fine balance that probably shifts over time in terms of how much work you need to do to get the reader to do the work that they need to do.
That's such an important point, because you could write a poem that's death sucks, I'm sad because of death, or something that's just sort of engaging with it really basically like that, and then this is not going to move anybody.
I'm unmoved.
I'm gonna have a biscuit.
I think perhaps we should read it again.
All right. 'Tis a Fearful Thing by Yehuda Halevi. 'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch, a fearful thing to love, to hope, to dream, to be, and oh, to lose. A thing for fools, this, and a holy thing to love. For your life has lived in me, your laugh once lifted me, your word was gift to me. To remember this brings painful joy. 'Tis a human thing, love, a holy thing to love, what death has touched.
This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? You know, get him off the mic. And whatever you feel like writing, head on over there, 5 stars, drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like, 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/Close Talking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything's possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.